Hey everyone, Jimmy Muller here at Muller Choke Tubes. In this video, I want to talk to you about shotshell length. There's been a lot of confusion, a lot of misconception about lengths of shot shells. So let's talk about 12 gauge, right? Right now in our hunting loads out there, we have 2.5 inch, 2 3/4 inch, 3 inch, and 3.5 inch, right? Now, the only difference is in shotshell length should be directly associated with the payload, meaning how many pellets can you fit inside it. So what I mean by that is, let's talk about steel shot for a moment. If you have a 2 3/4 inch hull, the maximum amount of steel shot that you could mostly fit in there is 1.25 ounces, 1.250 ounces. Now, if you're shooting or loading steel 7s, let's say, you could probably load a little more in there. If you're loading something big like 2s or number 1s or BB, it's going to be a little less, right? Because it takes up more space. Now, if we go to 3 inch, we could go to 1 3/8. If we go to 3.5 inch, which I like to refer to as a quarter stick of dynamite, you're talking 1 9/16, which is 1.562 ounces, or 1 5/8 ounces, which is 1.625 ounces. Now, again, if you're loading smaller shot, you could probably fit a little extra in, meaning, a little extra, maybe an extra 1/8 of an ounce, if that. And if you're loading something large like 2s or 1s or BB, it's going to be a little less than that, right? That's the only difference in hull length or shot shell length. What I mean by that on the opposite end of the spectrum is if you're using TSS, which is 18 grams per cubic centimeter, a lot heavier than lead, you could fit a lot more payload in ounces versus steel shot or bismuth, right? So in any standard 2 3/4 inch hull, you could fit well over 2 ounces of TSS, like number 7s, or smaller, right? Plenty of TSS in a 2 3/4 inch hull. If you use 3 inch hull or 3.5 inch hull for TSS, you're going to need to put in a much taller base wad, or shall I say a wad with a much taller compression area, or you're going to need to fill the space with fiber space wads or some other type of spacer to take up all of the room where there is no shot. Because as I said, a 2 3/4 inch hull can fit well over 2 ounces of tungsten or TSS, right? So these are the differences of shot shell length and hull length. In regards to ballistics, as the hunter, I could tell you that there's not a lot of benefits from one to the other, provided they have the right components in them, right? And what I mean by that is, if you take a 2.5 inch hull versus a 3.5 inch hull, and you put the same 1 ounce load in it, regardless of hull length, it's going to perform about the same, right? Now, the pressures inside the chamber may vary slightly, but as the end user, you don't have to worry about that, because the ammo company has already taken into consideration SAAMI standards, SAAMI standards for proof pressures. So when it comes to hull length, in regards to you as the hunter, just understand that the main differences, and really the only differences, are how much you could fit in one and not the other. So again, quick recap: 2 3/4 inch hull for steel shot, 1.25 ounces, 3 inch, 1 3/8 ounces, 3.5 inch, up to 1 5/8 ounces, right? Bismuth, a little heavier than that. Tungsten, TSS, a lot heavier than that. And that's it. Other than that, there is no advantage or disadvantage to the different shot shell lengths, other than when you get into 3.5 inch, of course, huge amounts of recoil. But if it's loaded right, or loaded the way it was intended to be loaded. It should have more pellets than all the rest. 3-inch, the standard Magnum load for long distance. Normally going to have plenty of pellets in it with not quite as much recoil or felt recoil as a 3.5-inch. And then 2 3/4 inch, sometimes more payload than we need with less recoil and usually less cost involved. So those are truly the differences of 2.5, 2 3/4, 3-inch, and 3.5 12-gauge length. And of course, these lengths also come into play with all other gauges, right? So same thing prevails. Payload, ballistics, all that fun stuff. So based on what I just taught you in this video, you could use that regardless of gauge and stuff. But payload is the only reason shot shell lengths are different, or shall I say, the only reason they should be different. They should be full of pellets. If they're not full of pellets, you should be using a shorter shot shell. All right? Thanks.